My name's Paige Rivard, and I'm the CEO of PWSA USA, and we're very excited today to bring you this School Success Summit. As I mentioned earlier, my son, who's 12 now, living with PWS, is in 6th grade, and I know our school journey has been a learning curve for all of us, and we continue to learn as we go. So we're super happy to share this information with you today and resources, and really hope that it will answer questions that you might have and make your school journey a little bit easier. And so again, if you joined us for the first session, Mackenzie did a wonderful job. She shared a lot of information about IEPs and BIPs and how to write a good IEP and goals and ways to document and measure specifically the ABCs of behavior. So she did a wonderful job, and all of these presentations are going to be recorded and shared out on our YouTube channel and our website. So they will be there within the next week. We have 3 more great sessions, I'm sure, for this afternoon. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Stacy Ward, our Director of Family Support, to introduce our next amazing speaker. Stacy?
Thank you, Paige. It is my pleasure to welcome Amy McTighe, who has over 20 years experience supporting persons with diverse learning needs in various settings. This experience has included supporting children and their families in public and private school settings, hospital rehabilitation programs, inpatient and outpatient behavioral health programs. Additionally, she has provided support to adults in community day programs, group homes, and supported living environments. Dr. McTighe is a graduate of the William & Mary Law School's Institute for Special Education Advocacy. She's a certified mental health first aid trainer. She's presented at the state, national, and international levels about Prader-Willi syndrome, Shaff-Yang syndrome, and many other complex disorders. She's published many articles on Prader-Willi syndrome, and she's recently authored a children's book titled Penny, A Tale of Lost Currency. Thank you, Amy. I'm going to share your slides for you. You just let me know when you'd like me to advance them.
Okay, great. Thanks, Stacy. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining the webinar today. Today we're going to discuss helpful tips for the IEP process. So Stacy, you can advance to the next slide.
Do you currently see the screen?
I do. Yeah.
Okay.
So, so I wanted to show, oh wait, yeah, now I'm only seeing myself.
Yeah, Stacey, it's not sharing. It doesn't.
Okay, give me one moment to try that again for you. How is that?
Perfect. That's great.
Okay.
All right. So, I just wanted to start by sharing 2 of my favorite cartoons related to the IEP process. This first one on the left says, outnumbered. I'm not sure why Mr. Barth feels compelled to bring an advocate to the IEP meeting, and you can see all of those people on the other side of the table. The second one on the right says, you know, this is the parent. This is the parent after an IEP meeting. Any questions? How many of you feel this way when planning for an IEP? I'm sure there's many people on the presentation or that are participating today that do. And, or does the school make you feel like you need to bring an advocate so that you even understand the process and what they're talking about? Or does the IEP process just completely exhaust you, just like it does to this parent in the cartoon on the right? Well, today, I'm going to give you some tips to survive this process and create an IEP that will really thoroughly support your child with Prader-Willi syndrome. Next slide. So during this webinar, I'm going to give you some helpful tips about signatures on the IEP, behavioral considerations, and ways to document concerns that you might have as a parent, and ideas surrounding transition supports from high school to the adult world. We're also going to talk about some specific program modifications and specially designed instruction that's essential to include for a student with Prader-Willi syndrome. And then finally, I want to talk about supports for school personnel and extracurricular activities. All of these tips are going to increase educational support that your child's going to receive, and more importantly, which is something that I feel very strongly about, increasing the overall quality of life and experiences that your child will have in the school setting. Next slide. Okay, so let's talk about, let us start with talking about signatures on an IEP. You may have had a time where you left an IEP meeting thinking and thought to yourself, like, why did I not sign this document that they're presenting to me? Or what, why was I never asked to actually sign the document that we went over? The federal special education law and regulations don't actually require a child's parent or caregiver to actually sign the IEP. Always remember that signing the IEP doesn't give consent to services described in the IEP. Most states have parents sign the IEP to show attendance only. And so all states have a form that documents that services outlined and discussed in the IEP have been agreed to, on by the parent or the caregiver. So Stacey, if you just hit the space bar, we'll talk about tip 1. So tip 1, signing the IEP does not mean that you agree with services or what's written in the actual document. So if they ask you to just sign that you're in attendance, it doesn't mean that you agree. It's typically just documenting that you're there and that you're listening to what the actual proposal is for services. Next slide. So now let's talk about behavioral considerations. So a question that the IEP team should also be asking and documenting in the IEP is, does the child have any behaviors that impede his or her learning or that of others? As we know, these behaviors may be manifesting in a variety of different ways for a person with Prader-Willi syndrome. So the behaviors may be around food. They may be physical or verbal aggression. They may even be behaviors related to non-compliance or skin picking even. And therefore, somewhere in the IEP, these behaviors need to be documented. Not only should a description of what the behaviors look like be included in a narrative form, so describing what you actually see with those behaviors, but a positive behavior supports and other strategies, such as a behavior plan, should also be included to address that behavior. So if we hit the space bar and we see tip number 2, always describe behaviors that are occurring in the school setting and determine positive behavior supports, such as a behavior plan that would be put in place to support those behaviors that you're seeing. Next slide. Okay, so the parent concerns section is one of the most important parts, in my opinion, of a child's IEP. This is where the parents can really share what they believe are the major concerns related to their child's academics, functional development, behavioral needs. This section is where your voice is heard. So it's really important to plan what you want to say before you attend the meeting to draft the IEP. So it's a really great idea to write out what your concerns are and ask that they be incorporated into the IEP document as you have written them. You can write concerns maybe in a bullet format, or you could write concerns in a narrative format, but you always want to ask the school to incorporate your exact comments and not a summary of what you said. So documenting your concerns in the IEP is also, in a formal way, is also really helpful if you ever need to go to a due process hearing. So tip number 3 is find a place in the IEP to document major concerns you have related to academics, functional development, or behavioral needs, and make sure your concerns are the exact words that you provided, not something that has been summarized by the school district. Next slide. So the next tip that I'd like to address focuses on transition services, and the purpose of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act overall is to ensure that all children with disabilities have the ability to have a free, appropriate education that emphasizes special education and related services that are designed to meet their own unique needs. And the most important part of this, the IDEA, is really focusing on supports that prepare the student for further education or post-secondary education, employment, and independent living. So all activities and education should really focus on improving academics, functional achievement, so that the child is able to appropriately engage in post-secondary activities, vocational education, and employment opportunities, as well as independent living. And every individual with Prader-Willi syndrome is different, as you know, and they all have unique strengths and needs that should be addressed in the transition section and when you're planning for that adult life. So transition services also, and in the federal law, transition services have to begin by the age of 16, but some states start transition services at a younger age. So tip number 4, it's essential to familiarize your state with yourself with your state's transition laws and work with the IEP team to develop transition supports that make sense for your child. Next slide. Okay, so program modifications and specially designed instruction is the section of the IEP where the IEP team outlines the specific supports that are needed that are different than what other children need to be successful. So let me give you an example. All kids may have access to a calculator academically for work during class to complete an in-class assessment. But all students aren't able to use a calculator on an assessment. So a person with Prader-Willi syndrome may need to use a calculator on the assessment to be successful. And that's different than what other kids are allowed to do. So a specially designed instruction topic might be that the child with Prader-Willi syndrome is able to use a calculator on assessments. Most importantly, this is the section where you would want to include that food security or a food secure environment is necessary for the success of your child in the school setting. Many schools that I work with across the country will talk at the IEP meeting about how they will implement a food secure environment. But whenever I review the IEP document, it doesn't necessarily reflect or say anything about food security. And then you'll go back into, you'll talk to the school and they'll say, well, we talked about that. Yeah, but it's not being done because it's not written there. So other examples of specially designed instruction may also include may include an alternative location for scheduled meals because of the heightened anxiety that a student may have when asked to eat in a large cafeteria. There may be a statement about how adult supervision is necessary for during meal times to monitor the student and provide verbal prompts to take their time with eating or to reduce choking episodes. You may add that food classes like home economics or instruction on learning to follow a recipe to make food is not appropriate. Or under this section, you may also add that food shouldn't be used as a reward for behavior. So the tip number 5 is it is really important to document supports, especially related to food exposure that makes sense for your child in the IEP. Specifically, most of the time it's done under the program modifications and specially designed instruction. Next slide. The next tip is related to school supports supports for school personnel. So you may have said to yourself, the IEP just doesn't understand Prader-Willi syndrome. They just don't understand how to support my child. It's so frustrating. How can I get the team to understand the complexity of this syndrome? And so the supports for school personnel section is where you document and address any services that would help the IEP team work more effectively with the student. So supports for school personnel should be provided on behalf of the student in order for the support to be advanced toward attaining annual goals, or to be involved in and progress in the general curriculum, or to participate in extracurricular activities and non-academic activities. So supports for school personnel include those that would help the team to really work more effectively with that student. Those can include special PWS training for the students' teachers from someone like myself, a staff member at PWSA USA, a staff member from your state PWS chapter, or it could even be from you as the parent. There's many times where I'll have, I have worked with families where they say, well, I go in the beginning of the year and support and explain what Prader-Willi syndrome is. And I'm not being taken real seriously. So would you be able to come in and explain to them what PWS is? So tip number 6 is always ask to include PWS training for the IEP team. This is really essential in order for your child to be successful. If the school doesn't honor this request, really make sure that you document that in the parent concern section, because, or, somewhere in the IEP that you had requested this and that you asked for the specific training, because that really has held up well in various due process cases that I've been involved in. So next slide. So finally, the last tip that I have is related to extracurricular activities. You may often ask yourself, can my child participate in extracurricular activities through the school, even if they may need some extra supports? And the answer to this is absolutely yes. Schools do more than teach children to read, to write, and to compute and do math problems. Along with academic activities, schools usually offer extracurricular and non-academic activities that the student with PWS may be interested in. But a lot of times the barriers are that there aren't the supports that they have in school in order for them to be successful. An extracurricular activity really is an activity that is performed by the students that falls outside of the realm of the normal curriculum of the school. So those activities typically involve students of the same age range and may be organized or supervised by school faculty or staff. So an important thing to remember is that the IEP or the IDEA covers the provision of non-academic and extracurricular activities and states that each child with a disability participates with non-disabled children in those extracurricular services and activities to the maximum extent appropriate to the need of that child. So the public agency or the school district must also ensure that each child with a disability has those supplemental aids and services determined by the child's IEP team to be appropriate and necessary so that the child can participate in those non-academic settings. So for example, I worked with a child in Kansas with Prader-Willi syndrome, and he was interested in running cross country for the school cross country team. And so this child had a one-to-one aide in the school setting and really needed this support to be successful in cross country, to monitor food security, keep the student on task, provide verbal reminders of expectations of what the coach was asking, making sure that they were on task during times that they were, working out and in practice and things like that. And so I worked with the school to educate them about the law related to extracurricular activities. And the aid was actually provided so that the student can participate in this activity with those non-disabled peers. So tip number 7 is, contrary to what the school may be telling you, your child can participate in extracurricular activities with support for the school or from the school. Okay, so next slide. Okay, so I wanted to open it up for questions and answers. I also included my contact information on this slide. If you have questions about the presentation or you'd like to talk more in depth about supports that could be implemented for your child with Prader-Willi syndrome, or if you're interested in partnering with me to educate your school about how to best support your child with PWS in the school setting. But I wanted to leave a lot of time so that we could answer specific questions that you may have related to the IEP process, other than the tips, or even including the tips that I included in this presentation.
Great, thank you, Amy. When you get a chance, can you turn off your camera and turn it back on? We lost your picture.
Sure.
Yeah, I just got kicked by Rose.
1 second. Ew, now I'm like completely frozen. There we go. How's that? Is that better?
It's a black screen for some reason.
Try it one more time.
No, it's
Yeah,
as if
still doesn't
you're,
work. Oh, no, not good.
yeah, your camera
Hey.
failed, it looks like. I'm gonna
Weird.
reshare the slide for 1 moment so people can finish copying down Amy's
There you go.
contact information.
And I can look at some of the questions.
Perfect. There's some questions in the chat.
Yeah,
and
there's some great
also
questions.
people, please feel free to use the Q&A section as well.
Yep. Okay, so some of the questions, how do we as parents, so the first question is, how do we as parents respond when support services are refused, such as a one-to-one? So that's a hard one. So one of the things that I think has been really successful is like really having a clear reason as to why you're asking for that one-to-one aid. And actually really bringing in somebody like myself or PWSA to explain why those supports are necessary, because I think at times school districts, in my experience, have seen that school districts will say, well, we want them to be independent. We want them to be as independent as possible. So the one-to-one aid doesn't make a lot of sense. That also, in that situation, is a educational moment for school districts to understand what independence means for people with Prader-Willi syndrome, because technically, you know, some parents that I've worked with have gotten the support for that one-to-one aid by saying, you know, really looking at the medical piece and how it is such a big you know, medical concern that the school district could be liable for if something happened, if that support wasn't there. And so that's something that, you know, you really at times need some more support rather than just yourself as the parent. Let's see, next question. Okay, so should there be goals for vocational training? Absolutely. And what should they look like? Any suggestions regarding vocational training? Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I've seen with Prader-Willi syndrome related to vocational training is that the school districts really look at, okay, so this is the program that we provide, and everybody in this specific program, say it's a life skills program, learning support, whatever is the placement, everybody's going to do the same vocational training. So they might work at a grocery store, or they might work at you know, a nursing home in the cafeteria or whatever their job is. And the vocational training goals should all be very focused specifically on what makes sense for that student. So, and what their interests are. So, you know, you can't force all kids with disabilities, regardless if it's Prader-Willi syndrome or not, to work in a specific setting, because there might be a student that's really interested in being a bagger in a grocery store, but there might be another student that's like, nope, I don't like doing that. I want to work with people more, or I want to work in a clerical position. So all of the vocational goals should be really focused on what the student's strengths are, and then also really taking into consideration what Prader-Willi syndrome is about. So really understanding that even if the vocational training is all focused around food service, the services that are provided are what's important. It's not the place that those services are being done. So you really want to uniquely identify what supports are in place. But absolutely, by the age of at least 16, there should be vocational training or some form of goal related to you know, employment or vocational education in that area. If the school says they don't have staff or resources for a one-to-one, that's something that makes me laugh, because so that actually is completely not okay to say that. School districts can't, under the IDEA, school districts can't deny services for kids because of financial reasons or because they just don't have the resources. They have to figure out ways to incorporate, like ways to get those supports. If I've had school districts in, you know, more rural areas, like for example, a school district that I'm working with in South Dakota, where they've actually employed a family member to come in and be that support until they were able to do some job searching and finding some employment to fill like an opening. They had a grandparent come in during the time that they were waiting to hire some one-to-one services. But they should never say that they don't have staff or resources, because if those are that is what the need is for your child to be successful in the least restrictive environment, then that's absolutely what the school district should be focusing on.
We have a few questions here in the Q&A as well,
sure.
Amy. One is, my child is turning 4. We live in New Jersey. If he is not yet shown excessive food-seeking behavior, will the school provide a one-to-one option?
Sometimes and sometimes not. So you have to think about the opportunity to provide so all of these questions, like, what are the vocational training goals, providing a one-to-one aid, those are all decisions that are supposed to be an IEP team decision. So, really explaining as a parent or with an advocate or supports from outside agencies as to why the one-to-one support is necessary based on the diagnosis of Prader-Willi syndrome. It really should not be something that the school is saying, well, we're not going to do this. It should be something that the team is deciding is necessary. So it shouldn't be something that, like, even in meetings where I've gone to before with parents, some parents or some school staff will say, well, I have to get back to you on and seeing if that will be approved. But technically, that's not okay to say, because what has to happen is that what really should happen is that this person behind the curtain shouldn't be approving things for the IEP. It should be a team decision, and the people at the table are, coming up with a case as to why a one-to-one aid would be necessary. Sometimes if the child is younger, that there is there's some like behavioral issues and things like that will support a one-to-one aid, but the way that you approach the reasons for why the aid is necessary is really key.
Yeah. The next question is, any tips on the teacher-parent relationship? So we know the teachers are underpaid, they still have to abide by the IEP. Right. So how will we know that they're taking the food security seriously, even if it's in the IEP? And most people do not truly view this the way they would if it was a student with a severe allergy, and be diligent in that regard.
Yeah, yes, that's a great question. So, so I think one of the things that really shows support around this area is related to data collection. So, for example, I'm working still with a child in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and he was having access. He was going to the cafeteria. It was a large middle school, going to the cafeteria and eating lunch in the cafeteria. But what we were seeing was after in the afternoon, all afternoon, he was having physical and verbal aggression because he had that food exposure during lunchtime. And when we collected data around, when those physical and verbal aggressions were happening, when I came in to support that, the school district said, well, he's fine in the lunchroom. He's doing okay in there, but which is totally makes sense. Most people with Prader-Willi syndrome, whenever they are around food, they're totally fine. It's afterwards that is the concern. And so what we were seeing is that after lunchtime, the physical and verbal aggression was increasing. That was the time that he was having those physical and verbal aggressions. So when we pulled him out of the lunchroom and had him eat in an alternative setting, we looked at the data, and that physical and verbal aggression in the afternoon actually decreased because he wasn't exposed to that food environment. And so really making sure that they understand, the biggest thing I think overall is education about the syndrome with the school team. And the more that you can get them to understand and see the view of what Prader-Willi syndrome is about and understand it in a thorough way, the better it's going to be, because that's going to support the student across the board. And even whenever there are things that arise, like, for example, having somebody on your IEP team that's going to problem solve when there's a field trip. What's this going to look like? This is upcoming, and being proactive about planning those things is going to be really key, and making sure that they thoroughly understand why this syndrome is going to be difficult for them in a lot of different ways.
That's a great segue into the next question.
Sure.
This person said, I asked in an email to my CSE director if we could do training for my son's teachers and therapists at the beginning of the year. I never received a response. Can I now have to put that into the IEP at his annual review under the parent concerns? Do I put a date about when I asked for it? Do I need to ask again? And then I have an additional follow-up to this, which would be, if you ask and they say no, do you require a PWN?
Yeah. So, yes, I would say that I would document the date that you asked for that and there was no response. So when they ask you what your concerns are, you would say on, March 9th, I asked for PWS training for my son or daughter, and this was never responded. This request was never responded to by the whatever. And I would actually specifically put the person that didn't respond, not their specific name, but their position. And then I would say, I'm requesting that this happen, and give a timeline. So say I'm requesting that this happens by, the start of the 23-24 school year, that this occurs at the beginning of every semester or whatever with new teachers. I have one school district that I'm working with that it's specifically written into the student's IEP that when they transition into the next grade level, that specific training will be supported by, I don't have them put a specific name because you just never know with a specific person. I have been in situations where my name has been in an IEP and then the school district is like, well, I don't want to go with that we want to go somewhere else. And then what ends up happening is that because it's written in the IEP, they have to specifically use the person that's written in the IEP. So you do want to give them a little bit of leeway in that regard. But the more that you can document in that parent section of things that you've asked for and were not delivered, it's going to be really key to do that, because that's what really helps during those due process cases, as Stacy, as you know, that really does help when you have all those things documented, or that you have them documented with emails and things like that.
Great. Are there other questions out there? I have a question for you, Amy.
Sure.
I'm seeing this more and more where the IEP team is getting together and having discussions, but they're not calling them IEP meetings.
Yeah.
So it's a parent concern meeting, or it is a meeting just to discuss the evaluation around an AAC device or an updated PT evaluation or something along those lines. And then the school is then excusing particular people from the meetings or not documenting it in the IEP.
Right. Yeah. So the reason why a lot of schools do that is because then they don't have to have the specific people in the IEP meeting that are required by law to be there. If they are changing something in the IEP, if the person, like say, for example, they're changing something about participation in the least restrictive environment with a regular ed teacher, that teacher, if they're changing anything in the IEP about that, the teacher that is the people that are responsible for that really should be at the meeting. There's some states that are okay with having revisions over the phone, as long as you document the people that were at the meeting, what was changed, and then the IEP team, and then you show that IEP team members of the team were all informed of that decision. If they're just having, it's okay to have just a parent concern meeting, but if you're changing actually something in the IEP or revising something or adding something, taking something out, you really should have the full team there to make that decision, because it shouldn't, like I said earlier in the presentation, it really should not be just one specific person's decision. It should be that whole team process. But that is happening a lot more frequently because of just what the purpose of the meeting. And sometimes it's okay and sometimes it isn't.
Yeah, I see it happen a lot with or due to coverage issues.
Yes. Yeah.
So, maybe this person doesn't necessarily need to be here.
Right.
So yeah, I am definitely seeing that a little bit more frequently. The other thing that I'm seeing is meetings being scheduled without the input of the parent. So what works best for the school is not always best for the parent. And then how would you recommend navigating those situations?
Yeah. So like the time and the place, you mean?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So the federal law states that it has to be at a mutually agreed upon time. And if the parent is a main part of the process, and if the parent is not able to attend the meeting at the specific time that the school said works for them, then the parent really, the IEP meeting, technically, if they responded and, like, for example, if the parent responds and says that they're able to come and they just don't go, they can have the meeting without the parent. But it really should be at a time that makes sense for everybody. And if the parent feels like, say the parent goes to the meeting and there isn't everybody there, you can absolutely stop that meeting and say, I don't feel comfortable having the rest of this meeting. A lot of times, with virtual options, some school districts will also give flex time to school for teachers to say, like, hey, leave a couple minutes early because you might have to do one at night. You have to do like a virtual meeting at night or something like that. That's really hard. It's really basically that you have to do the mutually agreed upon time. And if they say that everybody else on the team except the parent agreed to that time, they really actually have more of a leg to stand on than you do as a parent to say, well, I wasn't able to come, unfortunately. Okay, so we have our first IEP meeting tomorrow for our foster son. He's in 8th grade, but works at preschool level. Are we wrong to ask for more of a focus on basic fundamentals versus social and life skills? That seems to be the school system. Yeah, no, absolutely. That makes total sense. The basic fundamentals of reading and writing, social and life skills, sometimes, especially if you're really far behind in academics, I think that's completely appropriate to ask. And I think rather than even just being as general as asking for those things, give specific examples of what you would really like to work on so that they kind of have an idea of how you really want, what you really want to work on, what specific skills you really want them to work on. That's totally appropriate at that age level. Some services aren't able to attend the IEP, such as the PT, speech, OT, but the parent hasn't received an update on goals and wants them to attend. Can the parent demand that services be in attendance? Absolutely. Yes, 100%. You can a lot of schools, because a lot of school districts have outside agencies that sometimes do the PT, OT, and speech services, or they don't necessarily hire them in-house. You absolutely can say that you want those people to be in attendance, and you will reschedule the meeting. If the school district, I have been in situations too, where the school district will say, yes, these people are coming. And then the day of, you get there and they say, I don't have, they weren't able to come due to scheduling issues, or we weren't able to bring them in, or we didn't have coverage. You can also, as a parent, stop the meeting and say, that you do not want to continue the meeting because you want input from those therapists. That's completely appropriate. Yeah.
Great point. Are there any other questions? I don't see anything else in the chat or the Q&A. I will share that specific example, Amy. A parent and I recently did that in IEP meeting. We asked for a specific therapist to be there, especially because there was concerns in those therapy sessions. Yeah. And they were not. Yes. So we rescheduled.
Yeah. And the more that you can, I always say, like, in the IEP process, another tip that I think that parents all need to know is that the more you document, the better off you are. Because if you're going to, you need to document what you've asked, what was discussed, who was there, in your own notes, and not necessarily what the school's documenting, because those notes are going to be really helpful in a due process case, or if you have to go to mediation or something along those lines. I have found, I obviously advocate for other kids. Yes, having a paper trail is always a good thing. I do advocate for students with other disabilities, but I have found it really does help when you have somebody like myself or Stacy to attend a meeting with you, because just the complexity of Prader-Willi syndrome is really hard for schools to understand, and really hard for them to understand why we're asking for specific program modifications and specially designed instruction and things like that. Is it normal process to be told that the wait is 45 days for an FBA from the time of request? In Pennsylvania, we do 60 days. So 45 is actually pretty good. But yeah, we typically, typically it takes some time to collect the data, and that should be 45 calendar days, so not school days. It should be, if you're doing 45, it should be actually school days, not calendar days. Or I'm sorry, calendar days, not
calendar days. Yes.
Yeah.
And I think, a little bit of what Mackenzie spoke about in the previous presentation was about what goes into that FBA, the amount of data that should be collected. Yep. You want them to do a thorough job, and that takes some time.
Yeah. So, yeah. You absolutely want to get a very thorough understanding of that. It's also hard to, I found with some of the FBAs, it's really hard when somebody is doing the FBA that doesn't understand Prader-Willi syndrome too. It's really tough when that's happening, because you don't necessarily get such of a thorough job done when they don't understand the syndrome. We have homeschool, and have heard of some families being able to get tutor help for academics. Are you familiar with that? Yes, I have I am familiar with that, where are you saying more tutor help for academics from the school or like outside agencies? Because I've actually have heard of both, like where some of the school districts will provide some supports for even students that are homeschooled. And then from the school. Yeah. So I have heard of the school being able to do some tutoring support. The other thing with homeschooling is I have a child that I've worked with in the past that was homeschooled, but also able to participate in extracurricular activities, and the supports that were necessary. They were previously in the school, so they knew kind of what an IEP looked like for that student, but then the parents decided to homeschool them. And so any supports that they needed for the extracurricular activities were also implemented in the schools, in like the school setting, and they participated in extracurricular activities as well.
Mm-hmm. And I would just share some of the homeschooling regulations are different state to state. So
yes, absolutely.
If you're considering that option, really take a look at what your state requires.
Yeah. And I think, just the final tip is that really familiarizing yourself with what your state does require. So for example, where I am in Pittsburgh, in Pennsylvania, our transition laws start at age 14. The federal law starts transition at age 16. I have a child that I'm working with in another state where they do the federal law with 16, but you can start transition services at any age. If you feel that transition needs to be talked about when they're in first, second, or third grade, even, that's completely okay. Like, it doesn't mean that you have to wait until age 16. You can do that sooner. All states are required to do it at least by 16, but some states have decided to be a little bit more proactive and started at a younger age.
That's a fantastic point, Amy. One of the attorneys that I've worked with that you're actually probably familiar with him through William and Mary, their program. He was adamant that transition discussion started in kindergarten.
Yeah.
Does post-secondary life look like for your child? What do you hope?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I know a lot of kids, something that's really hard is whenever a student is placed in a more functional life skills program, really making sure that it's the services that the student needs is what's being addressed, and not just like, this is what we do in our program, because it's the services that you really need to focus on. So like, for example, if they're doing functional skills around cooking, a lot of schools have like coffee shops to teach kids like, vocational skills and stuff like that. Or they have like, jobs in the school, jobs in the cafeteria or stuff like that, because everybody's doing that in the classroom. It doesn't mean that the person with Prader-Willi syndrome needs to do that, because what I see a lot is that those kids are forced to be in that class or that activity because that's what everybody else is doing, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's what's best for them. Do they need independence with completing, like following a basic recipe to make a meal? Probably not. But do they need independence with maybe laundry or something along those lines? Sure. But really, just because everybody else is doing it doesn't mean that your child has to, and you can really push that, because it's really about the service, not the place.
Mm-hmm. It's a great point. There's a lot of questions and comments in the chat if you want to take a look at those.
Yeah, let me see. Let's see. Okay. Let's see where schools say they don't have schools. Okay. I've always done, did I discuss? Okay. Can you, yes, perfect. Like if you say, I can't make that time or date as a member of the team, I'd like to meet with the team, and could you please get back to me by 2 business days that works for you? Yes, absolutely. If you're documenting that as like that they said no, but then you're saying, yes, you can, that's a perfect approach. Yeah, absolutely. I'm just trying to figure out where the first question is that I left off. How do you get someone to attend an IEP meeting, or do you have to? No, you don't absolutely. You do not have to have somebody from your state. Stacy and I can definitely attest. I work with kids and adults, kids and adults all across the country. So you absolutely do not have to have somebody attend the IEP meeting from your state. You can't, especially with the virtual world now, you can definitely have people, that are familiar with Prader-Willi syndrome attend those IEP meetings that don't live in your state. Should it be documented on the IEP that I disagree that my son should graduate on time, even if he's on track to complete his credits, if developmentally he's not ready? Yes, 100%. So a lot of school districts, some school districts, most school districts will have, that requirement that they don't have to graduate on time, that they can go through graduation at the typical time that they're scheduled to do that. But like say they're a senior this year, they could walk through the graduation ceremony, but then receive the diploma at the time that they're 21. So you absolutely want to document that, that yes, you don't want them to graduate, and you still feel that there's other services and supports that they could access in order to be successful.
The other thing I would add to that is that you start documenting that early. Not if graduation is in May. Yep. You don't want to first start talking about that in April.
Right. 100%. Yep. Yeah. I think the last question is that if you wanted someone to attend, like myself to attend, you can absolutely reach out to me directly. That's why I left my contact information. Sure. I'd be happy to do that.